November 6, 1917, the city of Halifax, Nova Scotia, was not expecting to become the site of the largest man-made explosion in human history prior to the development of nuclear weapons. It was simply a cold Thursday in a city that had grown weary of the Great War. The sky was a pale, crisp blue, and the harbor was teeming with the sort of industrial chaos that defines a vital wartime port. To understand how two ships moving at the speed of a brisk walk could erase a city, one must first understand the precarious nature of the cargo they carried and the rigid, often stubborn, rules of the sea. Halifax was the Warden of the North, a strategic jewel in the British Empire's crown. Its deep water harbor was the primary assembly point for transatlantic convoys carrying supplies, munitions, and men to the bloody trenches of Europe. The city was divided into two parts by a narrow strait called the Narrows, which connected the outer harbor to the expansive Bedford Basin. This passage was the carotid artery of the port, a bottleneck where ships of all nations had to dance a delicate, slow-motion ballet to avoid one another. On this particular morning, the dance was about to go horribly wrong. The first vessel in our story is the SS Mont-Blanc, a French cargo ship. To look at her, she was an unremarkable, somewhat aged tramp steamer. However, her belly held a secret so volatile that her captain, Aimé Lemaitre, was understandably terrified. The Mont-Blanc was packed to the hatches with explosives. Her manifest included 2,300 tons of picric acid, 200 tons of TNT, 10 tons of gun cotton, and 35 tons of high-octane benzol stored in drums on the open deck. She was, for all intents and purposes, a floating bomb with a very short fuse. Because of the wartime regulations and the fear of German sabotage, the Mont-Blanc was not permitted to fly the red Ha flag that would signify she carried dangerous cargo. She was a silent, lethal shadow creeping into the harbor. The second vessel was the SS Imo, a Norwegian steamship under charter to the Commission for Relief in Belgium. The Imo was a larger, faster ship, and on this morning she was in a tremendous hurry. She had been delayed in the Bedford Basin by a late coal delivery and was eager to make up for lost time to reach New York. Her captain, Håkon Frum, was known to be a man of some impatience. The Imo was in ballast, meaning she carried no cargo, which caused her hull to sit high in the water, making her notoriously difficult to maneuver in the tight currents of the Narrows. At approximately 8:45 a.m., the two ships sighted one another. Under the international rule of the road, ships passing in a channel should stay to their right or the starboard side, passing port to port. The Mont-Blanc, entering from the ocean, followed this rule strictly. However, the Imo, exiting the basin, found her path obstructed by another ship, the SS Clara, which was being piloted on the wrong side of the channel. To avoid the Clara, the Imo moved further into the center of the strait. Shortly after, she encountered a tugboat called the Stella Maris, which forced the Imo even further towards the Dartmouth shore, directly into the path of the oncoming Mont-Blanc. Captain Lemaitre of the Mont-Blanc saw the Imo looming in his lane. He blew a single short blast of his whistle, indicating that he had the right of way and intended to maintain his course. In a standard situation, the Imo would have veered back to her own side. Instead, the Imo responded with two short blasts. This was a signal of defiance. I am directing my course to port. Essentially, the Imo was telling the munition ship that she would not move. The situation was now critical, yet the ships were moving so slowly that a casual observer on the shore might have thought nothing was amiss. On the bridge of the Mont-Blanc, the pilot, Francis Mackey, urged the captain to stop the engines. Lemaitre did so, but the momentum of the heavy ship carried her forward. He blew the whistle again, a desperate plea for the Imo to move. Again, the Imo responded with two blasts. It was a maritime game of chicken where one participant did not realize the other was made of dynamite. At the last possible second, Lemaitre ordered the Mont-Blanc to steer hard to port, hoping to pass the Imo on her starboard side. Simultaneously, the captain of the Imo finally realized the danger and ordered his engines into full reverse. But the Imo's high-sitting hull and the transverse thrust of her backing propeller caused her bow to swing uncontrollably to the right. The collision was not a thunderous crash. It was a grinding, screeching groan of metal on metal. The Imo's prow cut a deep V-shaped gash into the bow of the Mont-Blanc. In any other circumstance, this would have been a routine, if expensive, insurance claim. But as the Imo reversed her engines to pull away from the French ship, the friction of the steel hulls created a shower of brilliant, white-hot sparks. Those sparks landed directly onto the drums of benzol that had been crushed and ruptured by the impact. Within seconds, a low blue flame flickered on the deck of the Mont-Blanc. The fire spread with terrifying speed, fed by the leaking fuel and the picric acid stored just beneath the floorboards. The French crew knew exactly what was about to happen. Captain Lemaitre gave the only order that made sense: abandon ship. As the crew rowed frantically towards the Dartmouth shore, the Mont-Blanc, now a towering inferno of black smoke and orange flames, drifted aimlessly towards the Halifax waterfront. To the thousands of people waking up in the city, the sight was a spectacle. They did not see a bomb, they saw a ship on fire. Children gathered at the docks, workers stopped in their tracks, and families pressed their faces against glass windows to watch the beautiful, deadly display, unaware that the countdown had already begun.
The Mont-Blanc was no longer a vessel. It was a ghost, a burning apparition pushed by the gentle tide and the lingering momentum of its collision with the Imo. It drifted toward Pier 6, the wooden structures of the Richmond district standing like dry tinder waiting for a match. The fire on deck was a chemical rainbow. Because of the picric acid and benzol, the smoke wasn't typical oily black. It was a column of soot shot through with impossible shades of orange, yellow, and deep purple. It was beautiful. That beauty was the city's undoing. Consider Vince Coleman, the train dispatcher for the Canadian Government Railways. From his office near Pier 6, he watched the French crew row away, their shouting incomprehensible but their terror universal. A warned dock worker shouted, "A powder ship, she's going to blow." Coleman bolted for the door, then stopped. He remembered the number 10 express from St. John was due in minutes, carrying hundreds toward the disaster. He went back to his key. The clicking of the telegraph was the only sound in the small office. "Hold up the train. Ammunition ship afire in harbor making for Pier 6 and will explode. Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys." It remains the most famous sentence in Canadian history. While Coleman typed, the Stella Maris, a sturdy tugboat under Captain Horatio Brannan, moved in. Brannan didn't know the full cargo, but he knew a burning ship near the piers was a recipe for catastrophe. He ordered his crew to break out the hoses. They sprayed the Mont-Blanc, the water turning to steam the moment it hit the white-hot steel plates. Seeing it wasn't enough, Brannan prepared a hawser. He was going to try to tow the monster away from the docks, back out into the center of the Narrows. It was a heroic, desperate, and ultimately suicidal gesture. The rope was barely secured when the heat became unbearable. Above the harbor, on the hills of North End Halifax, the schools were beginning their morning lessons. At the Richmond School, children huddled by the windows. In the houses lining Campbell Road, mothers held toddlers up to see the big fire. To an observer in 1917, a ship on fire was a rare, exciting break from the monotony of wartime rationing and cold December mornings. They did not know that the glass they were pressing their faces against would soon become thousands of tiny daggers. At 9:04:35 a.m., the chemical threshold was reached. Inside the hold of the Mont-Blanc, the temperature had risen to the point where the picric acid didn't just burn, it underwent a molecular transition. In an instant, faster than the human nervous system can register pain, the solids and liquids within the ship's hull expanded into a sphere of superheated gas. The explosion was not a single event. It was a sequence of physics occurring in milliseconds. First, the ship itself ceased to exist. The 3,000 tons of steel that made up the Mont-Blanc were pulverized. Fragments of the hull were launched miles into the air. A half-ton piece of the ship's anchor was blown nearly 4 kilometers across the northwest arm. A gun from the deck landed miles away in Dartmouth. The blast created a pressure wave that traveled at more than 1,000 meters per second. This wasn't wind, it was a wall of compressed air that acted like a solid object. When it hit the Richmond district, it didn't just knock houses over, it erased them. The wooden homes were shattered into splinters instantly. But the air was only the first medium. The explosion happened at the waterline. The force pushed the water outward with such violence that for a brief moment the floor of the harbor was exposed. Then, the sea rushed back in to fill the void, creating a massive tsunami. A wall of water 30 feet high surged onto the shores of Halifax and Dartmouth. It picked up the wreckage of the piers, the remains of the Stella Maris, and the shattered railway cars and hurled them inland. For those further away, the first sign was the light, a flash so bright it was visible in Charlottetown. It was a light that blinded those who were looking directly at it. Then came the sound, a roar so massive it was heard in northern Maine. But in the immediate vicinity of Pier 6, there was no sound for the victims, because the pressure wave moved faster than the sound of the blast itself. One moment, a man might be walking his dog. The next, the world simply dissolved into gray dust and heat. The thermal radiation was the next layer of the nightmare. For a radius of several hundred yards, the heat was intense enough to ignite clothing and hair instantly. People who weren't hit by debris found themselves suddenly engulfed in flames. In the city center, over a mile away, the shockwave arrived with the force of a hammer. The massive stone buildings of downtown Halifax groaned. The windows of the department stores, the banks, and the government offices shattered simultaneously. The Halifax blizzard had begun, not of snow, but of glass. Thousands of people who had been watching the fire from their windows were struck by a horizontal hail of shards. It was a massacre of the eyes. Surgeons would spend the next 48 hours performing more eye removals than had been seen in the entirety of the Great War to date. The Imo, the ship that had started it all, was not spared. The blast wave caught the neutral vessel and tossed it across the harbor like a toy, grounding it on the Dartmouth shore. Most of its crew were killed instantly by the pressure. As the smoke began to rise, forming a precursor to what we now recognize as a mushroom cloud, the city of Halifax fell into a momentary, terrifying silence. The roar had passed, replaced by the sound of falling debris, soft falling wreckage.
The pressure wave was gone, but the harbor was not finished. The water had been pushed out by the force of nearly 3 kilotons of energy. Now it came back. A wall of water 30 feet high surged toward the shattered remains of Richmond and the Dartmouth shore. This was not a gentle tide. It was a scoured surge that carried the debris of ships, piers, and heavy machinery, slamming them into the already ruined foundations of the city. It swept into the low-lying areas, drowning those who had survived the initial shock, but were pinned beneath the wreckage of their homes. On the Dartmouth side, the Mi'kmaq community of Turtle Grove, which had existed for generations on the water's edge, was virtually erased by the wave. The water didn't just bring drowning, it brought the frigid, salt-choked debris of an industrial harbor, depositing it deep into the city streets like a layer of morbid silt. As the water receded, a new horror descended from the sky. The massive column of smoke and debris that had reached miles into the atmosphere began to collapse. It brought with it a thick, oily black rain. This was the evaporated residue of the Mont-Blanc's cargo, crude oil, soot, and the pulverized dust of the city. It coated everything in a slippery, dark veneer. Survivors, many of them stripped of their clothing by the sheer pressure of the blast wave, were covered in this grime, giving them a ghostly, charred appearance that made it impossible to distinguish friend from stranger. It was a scene of monochromatic nightmare. Men and women stumbled through the streets, their skin blackened and their clothes in tatters, looking like apparitions rising from a coal mine. Then came the fire. In 1917, Halifax was a city built of seasoned wood, and on a cold December morning, almost every household had a coal stove or a fireplace burning. When the blast wave leveled these homes, it knocked over these heat sources into piles of dry, shattered kindling. Within minutes, hundreds of individual fires merged into a massive conflagration that swept through the ruins of the North End. For those trapped under the heavy beams of their houses, the fire was a more immediate threat than their traumatic injuries. Neighbors worked frantically with bare hands, clawing at the splintered timber to pull victims out before the flames reached them. There were no sirens to be heard. The fire department's pride, the Patricia pumper truck, lay in twisted ruins near the pier, its crew dead or dying in the initial moments. The medical crisis was beyond anything the North American continent had ever seen. The Victoria General Hospital and Camp Hill were quickly overwhelmed. Every hallway, every closet, and eventually the lawns outside were filled with the wounded. The injuries were specific and gruesome. Beyond the broken limbs and internal traumas, there were the victims of the Halifax blizzard. Because thousands had been watching the fire from their windows, the glass had acted like shrapnel. Surgeons found themselves performing a grim assembly line of eye removals. They worked by candlelight and whatever gray winter light filtered through the remaining window frames. Morphine and bandages ran out within hours. Local pharmacies were emptied of their stock, and still the carts and wagons arrived with more bodies, some barely clinging to life. Amidst this chaos, a secondary terror took hold. A rumor began to spread, jumping from person to person with the speed of the fire itself. The magazine at the Wellington barracks was about to explode. This was not an unreasonable fear. The city was an armed camp, and several munition stores were located near the blast zone. The cry of "another explosion is coming" sent thousands of survivors, many bleeding and in shock, fleeing toward the open space of the Halifax Commons. They left the relative shelter of the ruins and the warmth of the small fires they had built to huddle in the biting wind, terrified that a second sun would rise from the harbor. This mass exodus hampered the initial rescue efforts. Men who had been digging into the rubble dropped their shovels and ran. Wagons carrying the wounded were diverted or abandoned in the panic. For 2 hours, the city held its breath, waiting for a second hammer blow that never came. When the panic finally subsided and people began to trickle back toward the ruins, they found that the fires had grown significantly, claiming many lives that might have been saved in those lost hours. The delay was a tragedy within a tragedy. By mid-afternoon, the sky began to change again. The bruised purple of the morning transitioned into a heavy, oppressive gray. The temperature, which had been hovering near freezing, began to plummet. Then the snow started. It was not a light dusting, but the beginning of a massive Atlantic blizzard. For the rescuers, it was a catastrophe. The snow began to cover the ruins, hiding the pockets of survivors who were still trapped and muffling their cries for help. For those lying in the wreckage or huddled on the open commons, the snow was a cold shroud. The very nature that had been indifferent to the explosion now seemed actively hostile. Yet the first ripples of help were already moving toward the city. Vince Coleman's final telegraph message had reached the outside world before the blast had severed the lines. In Truro and Moncton and as far away as Boston, the message, "Acknowledge this," had galvanized a massive response. Relief trains were being organized, loaded with doctors, nurses, and supplies. But they were fighting against the same blizzard that was burying the city. The tracks were blocked by snow and the wreckage of the rail yards. The city was isolated, burning, and freezing, its heart torn out by a ship that no longer existed. The residents of Halifax were on their own in a frozen darkness, waiting for a morning that many would not live to see.
The resilience of the human spirit was being tested by fire, water, and ice simultaneously.